The Devil Made Me Do It. The subtitle of the third film in the main sequence of the Conjuring franchise, not counting spin-offs like Annabelle and The Nun, has become a cliché and has been used as a justification for a variety of terrifying real-life crimes over the years. But the true story behind The Conjuring 3 is also the first time in American history that demonic possession was used as a defense in a court of law. In February 1981, Arne Cheyenne Johnson stabbed his landlord several times with a 5-inch pocket knife. The crime became the first murder on the books in the 193-year history of the sleepy town of Brookfield, Connecticut, but according to Johnson, while his was the hand that held the knife, the crime was actually committed by a demonic force that possessed him. Months earlier, Johnson had been present when amateur demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren had performed an exorcism on an 11-year-old boy. He claimed that one of the demons possessing the child had entered him and driven him to his dark deeds. Now, here's the real story behind The Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It. On February 16, 1981, Arne Cheyenne Johnson repeatedly plunged a 5-inch pocket knife into the chest of his landlord, Alan Bono, who later succumbed to his many wounds in the hospital. At the time, Johnson was 19 years old and working as a tree surgeon. He had moved with his girlfriend David Glatzel into a room adjacent to the Brookfield Pet Motel, where Debbie worked as a groomer. The 40-year-old Bono, who owned both the Pet Motel and the room, had taken them all out to the Mug and Munch Cafe earlier in the day, where witnesses say they had been drinking heavily. Johnson was later found by police 2 miles away from the scene of the crime at a bar called Hackney's. It marked the first recorded homicide in the 193-year history of the small Connecticut town of around 13,000. The motive behind the slaying depends on who you ask. Prosecutors claim that it was just a case of drinking gone bad. But if you ask Arne Cheyenne Johnson, his girlfriend Debbie, who is now his wife, or amateur demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, the devil made him do it. While the story ended for Johnson's victim on that February night, according to Johnson and his fiancée, Debbie Glatzel, it had started months before, when Debbie's younger brother David woke screaming, saying that he had been visited by a man with big black eyes, a thin face with animal features and jagged teeth, pointed ears, horns, and hoofs. The terrifying entity told him, "Beware." Unfortunately for the Glatzel family, that was only the beginning. "We believe David," Debbie Glatzel said of her then 11-year-old brother. "He didn't lie, and he never liked anything spooky, not even scary comic books." David continued to suffer nightmares of the figure that his family came to call the Beast, and it even began to appear before him during the day, taking the form of a little old man with burnt-looking skin and a plaid shirt torn at the elbow. The family heard odd noises from the attic, and David would wake up with unexplained scratches and bruises on his body. At night, someone had to sit up with him. He would kick, bite, spit, swear terrible words, his mother later said. She also described invisible hands strangling him and powerful forces that would flop him rapidly head to toe like a rag doll. He gained 60 pounds in only a few months, and quoted from the Bible and from Milton's Paradise Lost. In desperation, the Glatzel family contacted the local Catholic church and, eventually, Ed and Lorraine Warren. While Ed interviewed the boy, I saw a black, misty form next to him, which told me we were dealing with something of a negative nature, Lorraine later said of their first encounter with David Glatzel. "We were sitting on a powder keg," she said, claiming that David made repeated references to stabbings. In fact, the October before Arne Cheyenne Johnson stabbed his landlord, the Warrens called the Brookfield police to warn them that they were working with clergy in a house they claimed to be a demonic lair, and that there was some potential, they thought, for some violent act. In their investigations, the Warrens concluded that no less than 43 demons were possessing young David Glatzel. According to the couple, they were present for 3 lesser exorcisms, which were attended by members of the local Catholic Church, although a spokesman for the diocese said no formal exorcism was ever asked for or performed. Whether or not actual exorcisms were performed, during the time that the Warrens were regularly visiting the Glatzel home to check in on David Glatzel, Cheyenne Johnson, who was then engaged to David's older sister Debbie, repeatedly demanded of the devil, "Come into me, leave the little lad alone." The Warrens and the Glatzels all claimed to have seen him make such a challenge and, according to Johnson's defense and the Warrens, the devil obviously took him up on it. In the weeks that followed, Johnson seemed to change. Debbie, who called her fiancé by his middle name, said Cheyenne would go into a trance. He would growl and say he saw the beast. Later he would have no memory of it. It was just like David. As Johnson's defense would later point out, he had never had any trouble with the law when he was younger. He had played Little League, sang in the church choir, and once used his earnings as a newspaper carrier to buy his mother an $80 car so she didn't have to walk to work. According to Johnson, the Warrens, and his lawyer, one of the demons that had been plaguing young David Glatzel had entered the 19-year-old man and forced him to take the life of his landlord. The courts have dealt with the existence of God, said Martin Manella, Johnson's attorney, who attempted to enter a plea of not guilty by claiming that his client was suffering from demonic possession at the moment of the crime. Now they're going to have to deal with the existence of the devil. While Johnson's defense had plenty of what they considered evidence, including testimony from the Warrens and Debbie Glatzel, not to mention photographs and tape recordings made during David Glatzel's supposed demonic possession, their case was not helped along by the refusal of the Catholic Church to cooperate. While the diocese acknowledged that 4 priests had worked with the Glatzels to try to help David, none of them were allowed to speak publicly about what had happened there, and church representatives vehemently denied the claim that any exorcism had ever been performed. "We hope that the priests will do what's right and come in and testify," Ed Warren, who claimed to have tapes showing that the priests had gone to the bishop to request an exorcism, said prior to the trial. "If they don't, we will have to subpoena them to testify, and we'll have to use our tapes to prove it." Debbie Glatzel claimed that her brother had experienced a vision, which he told her about the day after Cheyenne Johnson fatally stabbed Ellen Bono. He said he had seen the beast go into Cheyenne's body, she said, and it was the beast who had committed the crime. Prosecutors claimed that the crime was the result of something very different entering Johnson's body, a lot of alcohol. The second witness called by the prosecution was a waitress at the Mug and Munch Cafe, who testified that Johnson and Bono had spent about 3 hours in the establishment on the day of the slaying, drinking between 13 and 15 glasses of wine. The crime, the prosecution asserted, was the result of a day spent drinking, which led to an altercation, which led, in turn, to Bono's violent demise. According to the EMT who arrived on the scene, Debbie Glatzel repeatedly said, "He didn't mean to do it, but you know how he gets when he's drinking." While Johnson's defense attempted to enter a plea of not guilty by virtue of demonic possession, presiding Judge Robert J. Callahan rejected the plea, claiming that it would be impossible to prove and that any attempt to do so would be irrelative and unscientific. Johnson's attorney then changed his plea to self-defense, but the jury, after 15 hours of deliberation over 3 days, found Johnson guilty of first-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to serve 10 to 20 years, but was released after 5. In 1983, less than 2 years after Cheyenne Johnson was convicted, Bantam Books published The Devil in Connecticut, a book written by Gerald Brittle, working with the Warrens. That same year, a TV movie called The Demon Murder Case premiered on NBC, also based on Johnson's crimes, albeit with the names and many of the details changed. The movie was directed by William Hale, who had previously helmed several episodes of Night Gallery from a screenplay by William Kelly, who would later pen the Harrison Ford-starring Amish thriller Witness. It featured Kelly McGillis and Danny Glover. The family received $2,000 from the book publisher at the time, but more than 20 years later, David Glatzel's brother, Carl, brought a lawsuit against Lorraine Warren, Gerald Brittle, and the publishing company that was reissuing the book, claiming that the Warrens were attempting to get rich and famous at our expense. According to Carl Glatzel, the Warrens told my family numerous times that we would be millionaires and the book would help get my sister's boyfriend, Arn, out of jail. The book's author, Gerald Brittle, on the other hand, claimed to have spent more than 100 hours interviewing the Glatzel family and that his book was based entirely on fact. Just to be sure I got it right, the family got the manuscript before it went to the printer, and they vouched to its accuracy, he said. Arn Cheyenne Johnson was 19 years old when he took the life of Alan Bono. He and Debbie Glatzel married in 1984 while Johnson was in prison and stayed together following his release for good behavior. While serving his time, Johnson also received his high school diploma and took a number of college courses, earning various educational certificates for the state's Department of Corrections. The chief of parole described Johnson as an exemplary inmate. In January 1986, after serving a little less than 5 years of his 10 to 20-year sentence for first-degree manslaughter, Arn Cheyenne Johnson was released. He should have been up for parole that February, but his exemplary behavior while behind bars led to him being released early. Authorities said that Johnson's mental condition was carefully examined prior to his release and that they found no negative factors. While in prison, Johnson had married Debbie Glatzel, and Ed and Lorraine Warren described the couple as very happy. Lorraine Warren told reporters, "He's coming home to live in a very good family atmosphere." The state parole board may have asserted that there were no negative factors in Arn Cheyenne Johnson's mental state when he was released from prison, but if he truly had been possessed by demons, as he claimed, then it wasn't really his mental state that was the issue. Fortunately, the Warrens averred that Johnson also showed no signs of being possessed following his release. "Possession doesn't last 24 hours a day," Ed Warren said. "Arn understands what happened to him. He now knows if something happens how to ward it off, and he won't be stupid enough to take on the devil again." "My brother was never possessed," Carl Glatzel Jr., who was 16 years old at the time of his younger brother David's supposed possession, said of a lawsuit that he and his brother brought against the Warrens more than 20 years later. "He, along with my family, was manipulated and exploited, something the Warrens were very good at." The suit, which calls the contents of the book The Devil in Connecticut Complete Lies, was prompted by the book being brought back into publication in 2007. Carl Glatzel Jr. asserted that his younger brother had suffered from mental illness. Certainly, the family had sought psychiatric help even while the Warrens were performing their investigations, and that the Warrens had exploited him and their family with promises that they would be millionaires. He also claimed that the publicity surrounding the case had cost him friends, relationships, and business opportunities over the years, and that the Warrens had painted him as a villain in the book simply because I had a sane voice and knew the story was false since the beginning. The Warrens, for their part, claimed that a satanic death curse was placed on both the Glatzel boys, and that Carl Jr. was oppressed by demons and used as a pawn to instigate violence and arouse skepticism. At the time of the suit, Johnson and his wife, Debbie Glatzel, whom he had married while in prison, still contended that the demonic possession story was true and supported Ed and Lorraine Warren, claiming that Carl Jr. was simply suing to make money.